How's it going, everyone? I'm Dylan, this is All You Can Board, and this is my full review on Sinister Motives, which is the fourth big box expansion for Marvel Champions. It seems nuts to me that we are at the fourth big box expansion for Marvel Champions already. I guess because I came into the game late, it just seems like I can't believe we have that many already, and there's likely going to be another one this year. So basically what I'm going to do for this review is we've already talked about the two heroes, Ghost Spider and Spider-Man Miles Morales, that came in this box. That did a review of each hero, so I'm not going to touch on any of the hero cards in this video. I am going to go through each of the villains and give my thoughts on them, and as well as highlight some of the key cards and some of the the cards I enjoyed the most from each of the villains, and give you my thoughts on them. And then at the end, I'm also going to go over some of the modular encounter sets and just some of the cards in there that I think are interesting for this campaign specifically, but also just that you'll be able to use going forward in other scenarios. If you've purchased the box to add to variability and longevity. And then finally, I'll give you my overall thoughts on which of the two heroes I think I prefer more than the other, my thoughts on how this box compares to other expansions, and then finally my final thoughts on the box itself. So without further ado, let's jump right in. We're going to start with the villains, and of course the first villain in this box is Sandman. So Sandman has an interesting mechanic. So basically, we'll just go over his villain card first, and then I'll sort of touch on a bunch of his other cards and tell you about the mechanics. So Sandman is 1 scheme, 2 attack. This is obviously level 1, and he has Sandblast. Now Sandblast is a force interrupt. When Sandman attacks you, that attack deals indirect damage. If your identity takes any amount of damage from that attack, resolve the Surging Sands ability on city streets. So Surging Sands and City Streets is sort of the main thematic ability here with Sandman, and the thing you're gonna have to deal with. So if we jump onto City Streets, you'll see the special here says Surging Sands, special, place 1 sand counter here. Discard cards from the top of the encounter deck equal to the number of sand counters here. So you're gonna place a sand counter first, and then whatever the amount of sand counters that are there you're gonna discard cards from the encounter deck according to that number. So essentially you're just gonna be going through the encounter deck a lot faster when you're playing Sandman, and which means that you're going to potentially get extra acceleration tokens, which is going to make it harder to win if the longer the game goes on. There could be good things where you're discarding encounter cards you didn't want to have to deal with, but generally if you let this go out of control too much, it's going to get very hard to deal with. And as we see when we get into some of the other cards, there are other ways that this comes into play. It's not simply just, oh, you're discarding cards, that's the entire mechanic. Other cards that are in his repertoire are going to play off of this Sandblast. But generally, that's like the main thing that you're dealing with here, but it's not just sort of this ever impending thing that's building up. There is a way to deal with it. There is a hero action on City Streets that says exhaust a character you control, remove sand counters from here equal to that character's attack. So what that means is it's not going to be too difficult for you to find ways to remove the sand counters. Every character, every hero in the game that you're going to play has a means of attacking. For sure, that's going to slow down your progress that you're making on taking out Sandman, but it makes it so that you always have the opportunity and the option to deal with the sand counters here if you find that it's something that is going to get out of control or is already starting to get out of control, to sort of curb that in advance. So I didn't find Sandman too difficult to manage. He was a really good first villain. You never want the first villain to be devastatingly difficult, because that would be a horrible way to sort of build up the expansion, and then every single hero would have to get progressively harder. It would just be too hard. So the first villain's always going to be a little bit easier. I found Sandman, especially when we get into some of his other cards, to be really interesting to deal with, and even though he isn't too difficult, and I think I did beat Sandman on the first attempt, it still was a really fun scenario to do. So one of the cards I want to look at here that you kind of see how these sand counters come into play is Sand Clone. So Sand Clone has 1 scheme, and it has X attack, 3 health. X is equal to the number of sand counters on city streets. So this gives you sort of an extra incentive to deal with those counters. If you find that you're thinking, you know what, before this gets out of control with discarding too many cards, I can probably beat Sandman. I don't care too much what the acceleration counter is. I'm making good progress on the damage. If you start to get sand clones coming out and you've got 5, 6 counters on city streets, suddenly these sand clones are going to be swinging for really high attack values, and then it's going to be something that you're either taking that damage, losing a bunch of allies to it, or having to find other ways to mitigate it, which is going to slow down your progress. So this is going to incentivize you to either kill this immediately or have city streets have less sand counters on it, so that when these come out, they just don't do as much to the board and the state of the game. But it is a cool card. It makes it so that if there's something else you have to deal with, and they were there was times where they came out and they was never devastating for me in the game I played, but more of an annoyance than anything that you kind of have to decide you're going to deal with. Then we have Dirt Trap. So Dirt Trap is an interesting side scheme because it has only a single threat on it, and it says when defeated, resolve the Surging Sands ability on city streets, and then resolve it again. So really devastating card here, and one that, you know, it's interesting because it only has that one threat on it, but it does have the little icon on the card that indicates, I'm forgetting the name of the icon, that's why I'm showing you guys. It's the exclamation mark, and I forget the names of some of these icons, but it's the one that essentially while this is in play, you have to remove threat from this scheme before you can remove threat from the main scheme. So this being in play, you might just say, well, I don't want to defeat this because I don't want Surging Sands to trigger twice, but it's going to get to the point potentially where the main scheme needs to be dealt with, and the only way to do that is to get rid of Dirt Trap, and getting rid of Dirt Trap means you're going to trigger that sand, that's Surging Sands twice, which is obviously really, really bad. So, and adding more counters to it could be powering up the sand clouds that are on the border. They're going to be coming up soon. So really interesting, the way all these cards work together, and it makes for a pretty difficult scenario. Not overly difficult, but more difficult the longer you let this build out of control. You can't just you can try to race it down and race it, to the finish before this stuff comes up, but generally I think at some point you're gonna have to deal with all these sand counters. Last one I wanted to look at was Sand Slide. This is a treachery that says, when revealed, place 2 sand counters on city streets and resolve its Surging Sands ability. If at least one Sandman card was discarded this way, you are stunned. All the times that this came out for me, I always got stunned, and maybe it was just because of how many cards I was discarding, but generally if you're placing 2 sand counters, you're going to at least be discarding 2 cards off of the top of the encounter deck. There's always going to be a decent chance you're going to hit a Sandman card because there are a ton of them in there, and all the times that I had hit this card, I had more than 2 counters on there, so it was almost a shoe-in that I was going to get stunned. So that's a really devastating card to always get stunned, and to also be adding sand counters on there too at once as well. And the boost ability I forgot to mention is resolve this card's when revealed effect. So one way or another, that card is likely going to hit the table, even whether it's a boost or whether it's through just the regular when revealed effect, and it's not going to be fun anytime. So that is Sandman. Those are all the cards I wanted to highlight. Like I said, he's a pretty good starting villain. Out of all the ones we've had, he's probably up there with my favorite starting villain, if not my favorite one. It's been a long time since I played, the Red Skull campaign box, and even Galaxy Most Wanted at this point. So I'd have to really go back and do those again to do a really good comparison. But just I'm more interested in the Sandman character than I was in I think it's Krang in Galaxy Most Wanted. So even just from a thematic standpoint, it resonates with me a little bit more, and I just found it a little bit more entertaining and fun to engage with. So that is Sandman. Next up, we have a big one, and one that I'm sure lots of people are excited about, and that is Venom. So Venom's scenario is pretty challenging, if a little confusing at times with some of the, and again, this is all based on my experience playing Venom, so maybe I just had a certain experience with it, but we'll get into it. But there's a mechanic involved with Venom that I found was almost a little bit unnecessary. I didn't really have to engage with it too much to end up winning, but we'll get to that. So Venom's level 1 here is 1 scheme to attack, Toughness, so he enters play with a tough status card, and Vengeance, force response. After you attack and damage Venom with a card you control, place 1 face down boost card on your identity. So this is one of Venom's big things, is he's going to be adding boost cards to your identity, and then as we'll see when we get to the scheme here, he's going to be pulling those off and dealing them to you. So again, the fact that it's every time you damage Venom with a card you control that you're going to be adding these, you really need to make your hits count. You're not just doing like a single ping damage very often on Venom. You need to be doing huge attacks to make it worth it to be dealt an encounter card that you're eventually going to have dealt to you. So that's an interesting mechanic in and of itself, is to have a villain that you can't just sort of snowball damage. You have to have these huge big hits. It works well with the characters, especially Ghost Spider that came in the box, but there's still going to be moments where you have 2 damage to deal, and you have to weigh, well, I do need to do damage to Venom, but do I really want right now to do 2 damage and have an encounter card put on my identity? So it's an interesting mechanic. I just did want to quickly add on that the second level of Venom adds 1 scheme, I believe. I think that's just 1 scheme, but it also adds Steady to the card. It has Toughness still. It also says when revealed, search the encounter deck and discard, however, the Tooth and Nail side scheme put into play, which we'll get to, and still has that force response. So it's a pretty big scale up. So even if you're doing the regular normal scenario, having the level 2 Venom come out is a pretty big swing, and that's usually, I think I did the scenario twice. I lost the first one, won the second one, and in both instances, I got through the first level of Venom pretty easily. I shouldn't say easily, but it wasn't a huge deal to any moments in there. And it happened pretty quickly that I got to the second level. And the second level, it was like a bit of a wall. I had to sort of, really get some sort of system in play to be able to beat him on that second attempt. There is a bit of a level jump up there. So I want to touch on the main scheme, which is leave us alone. So force interrupt here. This is this will give you an idea of how this works in conjunction with the Venom card, all those encounter cards that are getting put onto your identity. So the force interrupt here is when Venom activates against you, move each face down boost card from your identity to Venom. So you're essentially going to have to take every single encounter card that's on your identity whenever Venom activates against you and move them to Venom, which really, really sucks and obviously is going to power him up and make things a lot more difficult for you. So again, this is where you have to sort of mitigate these encounter cards that are getting added to your identity and knowing how many you can sustain, how many you can have on there and still survive, and how much damage is worth getting one of those added on. And I did just want to clarify, because I realized I kept saying encounter cards. The encounter cards that are put onto your identity and then moved to Venom when he activates, they're being used as boost cards. They're not actually being used for the actual when revealed effect on there. So don't worry, you're not going to get dealt 4 or 5 boost cards or encounter cards at once. They are just boosting Venom, but still that damage can really rack up, and suddenly you could have Venom hitting you for 12 damage on a single swing, which kills both heroes if there's no one defending it. So still something you have to deal with, but just so you don't accidentally play them incorrectly, they are not used as encounter cards, they are boost cards. Okay, so this is what I was talking about. We're going to get into the environment now, which is Bell Tower. So this is meant as a way to assist you. So it is an environment card, and it says if there are at least, and I should mention, it has 2 sides. We're going to start with the quiet side. The quiet side says if there are at least 3 chime counters per player here, flip this card. So you're basically trying to get chime counters onto it, like ringing the bell, and when you hit that threshold, you're going to flip it onto the ringing side. The interrupt here says when any amount of damage would be dealt to Venom by an attack, you may place that many chime counters here instead. So basically what you're hoping to do here is any of your minuscule attacks, any of your small attacks, the ones doing 1 damage, 2 damage, that may not be worth getting a boost card added to your identity with Venom, you're doing that to the Bell Tower instead to eventually get to the ringing side. The ringing side, the reason you're wanting to do that, says increase all damage Venom takes by 1. So obviously this is just here to help you. You should be using it. It's just interesting because in the second game I played, the one that I won, I found that without even intentionally doing it, I ended up neglecting the Bell Tower, and I ended up just pushing a lot of damage onto Venom, even when it meant adding extra boost cards onto my identity, and I ended up winning on that one. And I don't know if that's necessarily the best strategy. There probably is a safer, more useful strategy that never makes you feel like you're taking these huge hits, but I had the right allies in play. I had blockers. I was able to do some defending with Ghost Spider and some of her cards to negate some activations of Venoms and stuff, so it ended up working out. I think I got the Bell Tower onto the ringing side once, and while it was there, I ended up doing 1 or 2 hits, and I got the extra couple bit of damage pings, but it was never something that really was swinging the game, so I ended up just ignoring it in that second phase of Venom and just pushing damage onto him, and I ended up winning. So only pointing that out because with having this environment in play that is there to help you, it can feel like, oh, this is a huge main mechanic. I have to be utilizing this all the time. Not saying you shouldn't, but I just wanted to let you know that in the game I won, I actually didn't utilize it all that much. Take that for what it's worth. Okay, so we're going to get into some of the other cards here. So I mentioned Tooth and Nail. This comes into play automatically on Venom's second phase. Interesting side scheme. It has 8 threat on it, and it says response after Venom takes any amount of damage from an attack, remove an equal amount of threat from here. So easy to remove threat from, even though there's a lot on there. Any damage you're dealing is also taking threat off here as well. It's doubling up, or you can use regular threat removal to do that as well. The reason you'd want to is that this adds an additional encounter card, which obviously is really bad. So that being in play is something you want to deal with right away. There are multiple ways to deal with it. It never really lasted and played too long for me, but that being said, if they start to add up and you have multiples of these in play, because there are other ones, suddenly the board could spiral out of control. So just wanted to point that out. A cool attachment here called Now We're Angry. Attached to Venom, it has 2 uses on this attachment, which is 2 rage counters. Venom's attacks all gain overkill. He gets +1 attack to his base stat. And force response after Venom takes any amount of damage from an attack, remove 1 rage counter from here. So The interesting thing here is this now prioritizes you dealing just any kind of damage to Venom, whether they're big or small. It's just to get rid of this because it's only, the interesting thing is it's only +1 damage. And I say only +1 damage because the boost cards that you're adding onto your identity is going to likely boost his attack by more than +1. So you might be thinking, what's another 1? That could be the 1 damage that kills you a lot of time because of how high Venom's attacks are going, or, you know, the one that clears your defense or things like that. So I just thought it was an interesting a card in the sense that it has those counters, and that's how you remove it. You can't just, you know, discard things from your hand to remove it. You have to specifically damage Venom to get it to go away. Interesting twist, and the boost actually reveals the card as well. So one way or another, that's hidden play. That's all I wanted to highlight for Venom. Venom is a pretty cool scenario. If anything, I was maybe a little bit let down, and I only say that because when the character of Venom is talked about, and, you know, and when he was announced to be a villain in this pack, I was obviously very excited, and I think there's a lot of hype around the Venom character. Always, even when, I mean, Venom won the poll for the other version of Venom, the Flash Thompson one, won the poll for, you know, favorite Marvel Champions hero last year, and I think that's just because not only was it a fun hero, but also just Venom thematically is one that resonates with a lot of people. So I know there was a lot of hype around this. I feel like it was hard to hit the expectations I maybe had for it. Still a lot of fun thematically. I think they did Venom really well. I just don't think it was my favorite scenario in the box by any means, but still a good scenario, not a bad one by any means. And what comes out of this, what happened, the aftermath of this scenario, I think is even the more exciting part, which we're going to get into, you know, sort of at the end of the video. Okay, so the next one we're going to talk about is Mysterio. This is probably the most unique of all the scenarios, I would say. Arguably the most unique, in that the main mechanic here is that encounter cards are being added from the encounter deck to your deck, and to your discard pile that are eventually going to get shuffled into your deck, and every time you draw them, bad stuff is going to happen. So your deck's going to get filled with these cards that are not yours. It kind of fits the illusion theme of Mysterio. There's a lot of really cool thematics going on in this pack, and some of the cards I selected to talk about. I really like Mysterio, and he was really challenging too. This one took me a couple tries as well. So Mysterio, the level 1 is a 2-scheme 1-attack villain. Seeds of Fear, force response. After you resolve a boost card during Mysterio's activation, place that card in your discard pile if it has the illusion trait. So this is the way that works, is every time the boost cards are used to power up his attacks or his schemes, if the illusion trait is on them, you're going to take that card, instead of putting it into the villain discard pile, you're going to put it into your discard pile. And eventually when those get shuffled into your deck, you're going to have to be able to draw them, and then bad stuff happens when you draw them. So really cool mechanic. I really, really appreciate Mysterio. I like when they find interesting ways to you know, work new mechanics or new ways of doing things into the game. And we have seen the cards of that came up, you know, like the Living Tribunal, that we add our cards into the enemy deck. It's now cool to see the reverse of that and kind of taking that to the next level and us having to deal with that. I really like that. So the main scheme here is Maze of Mirrors. The force interrupt that I want to talk about says when you would draw or discard an encounter card from your deck, so when you finally do draw those cards, or you discard it, there's no way around it, deal it to yourself as a face down encounter card, and then draw 1 card. So this is why these get bad, is that essentially you're going to be getting doubles of encounter cards where they function as boost cards and then go into your deck, and then will function as encounter cards as well. All the ones that are in your deck, you can have an idea of what's coming up because you've seen them as boost cards, but you're now going to have to deal with their when revealed effects and their actual text boxes as they come up, and there could be a whole bunch of them coming up. Now you do get the card draw, so it's not like it takes a slot in your hand and you have a lower hand. That would just be you know, really, really difficult. So you still get to draw up to the cards you wanted, but those cards are going to get dealt to you, and you're going to have a bunch of encounter cards you're dealing with. So it's a really big pain as they start to fill up your deck. So you know how there's this inevitability that they will come up if you don't beat Mysterio soon. And sometimes if it's too early in the scenario, you're like, well, these are going to come up. I do want to draw more cards. I'm going to have to deal with them. And you have to kind of just prepare and kind of try to remember what's in your deck as well. Really, really cool. I love the mechanic of Mysterio. So then one of the minions that you're going to see pop up, and there's multiple copies of these in the deck, is Shifting Apparition. Now these are 1 scheme, 1 attack, 1 health minions, very weak stats all around. And they do have guard though, which means that you do have to deal with them before you deal with the villain. One way or another you have to deal with them. And the interesting part here is when defeated, if this minion was defeated with excess damage, the defeating player shuffles the top card of the encounter deck into their deck. The reason I love this is because it prioritizes now you trying to find a way to do exactly 1 damage, which let me tell you, with Miles and Gwen, I obviously used the decks that they came with. I didn't go and like build new decks. I was playtesting and stuff like that. But it was really hard, if not impossible, to do one damage. Like the way I had to do it was always with allies. Allies that had, you know, one attack, I could do it, but both Gwen and Miles do 2 on their base attacks and don't really have other options to do 1. So very often I was having to kill these with excess damage and then add more encounter decks into my deck. And you can't just say, oh, I'll leave it out there because they're really weak, because they have guard. So it's a really cool design that they did there, where it's like, here's this weak enemy that's not going to really do much damage to you, but you can't do anything to the villain if you don't take it out. But if you have to do more than 1 damage, you're going to get a penalty. I really like it. I thought that was one of my favorite cards in the Mysterio set of cards. Then we had Fearmonger. So this is a treachery that says Surge right off the top, so you're going to have to draw into something else. And it also says, when revealed, discard your hand, then draw up to your hand size. Now, the reason I want to talk about this is potentially really bad or really good. There's you know, I've had this hit both ways, and that's what I thought was really interesting. Is there was times I had drawn a hand and was looking at going, oh, next turn is going to be great. I have, you know, the ability to do 10 damage with Gwen right off this hand, and I have the ability to do this with Miles, whatever the case may be. And then Fearmonger comes up, and I lose the entire hand. And I guess I draw back up to that same amount, but I've lost all these really valuable cards. And obviously, you're going through your deck a little bit quicker, which means you're drawing into encounter cards quicker. Now, the only potential upside here is that if you've used cards on the villain's phase, you know, through defending, especially with Gwen, this happened a lot, where, you know, I use cards to, you know, negate activations, things like that, and my hand size is already smaller than it should be. Suddenly, this actually, I guess I lose those cards, but I gain back the cards that I had lost, and I'm back to a full hand size. So I still am going through the deck to the encounter cards quicker, but it was interesting to see a bit of an upside there. I think that's why the card does have Surge, so you always kind of have this detriment with it, but it was an interesting card nonetheless. Then we have Masterful Mirage. So this says, attached to Mysterio, he gets +1 scheme, force interrupt. When you would deal any amount of damage to Mysterio, discard the top 4 cards of your deck instead, then discard this card. The reason I'm bringing this one up is because this is one of the main cards that's going to make you go through your deck quicker and discard into those encounter cards. Remember, if you discard an encounter card, it still does get dealt to you. You don't skip it or anything like that. So this card specifically is just getting you through to those encounter cards quicker, and obviously you're going through your deck quicker too, which isn't necessarily what you want to be doing either. So then we have Deja Vu. So Deja Vu is a treachery that says peril right off the bat, so when you're resolving this, other players cannot help you. When revealed, choose to either take 1 damage or place 1 threat on the main scheme. Both small amounts, obviously, but then it says shuffle Deja Vu into any player's deck. That essentially means that this card is permanent, because every single time it's shuffled into your deck, when it comes out again, you're going to just read the when revealed effect. It's going to do another damage or remove 1 threat and go back into your deck. It will constantly be going back into your deck. And so even though it only is doing 1 damage or 1 threat removal, the more this is going to be coming up, the more you're going to have to deal with. And that is a huge annoyance, a huge pain. So really, really interesting card. I felt that when I first saw that one come up, I thought, okay, this isn't that big of a deal. And it was only when I clued in, like, oh my god, I've seen this card like 5 times now, that I realized, like, okay, yeah, that's adding up after a while, and you know, it is starting to get really annoying the more it comes up, and I can't find a way to get rid of it. So really cool card. That's Mysterio. Mysterio is up there with one of my favorite villains in the pack, mostly from the thematic standpoint. I don't think he was the most fun for me to engage with out of the 5, but like in terms of being unique and what he brings to the table with those mechanics, Mysterio is absolutely great. I love the scenario. I love the idea of having them encounter cards mixed into my deck. It was just a lot of fun all around. All right, let's talk about the Sinister Six. That's where the name of the box comes from, Sinister Motives. One of the most exciting, you know, scenarios we've got for sure, because the Sinister Six is obviously, you know, a well-regarded, hyped-up thing. Even in the movies, there's always the talk of, like, when are they going to incorporate the Sinister Six in the MCU or in Sony's movies and things like that. So it's really cool that we got them as a scenario here, and we got all of, like, these huge villains with it as well. So we have Vulture, Kraven, Hobgoblin, Scorpion, Electro, and Dr. Octopus, all in one scenario. Now, this one is super interesting. It has the potential to be unbelievably difficult, or in one of the case where I ended up winning, I think this took me 3, maybe 4 tries, I'm trying to remember now, one of the 2, but, or yeah, it was either 3 or 4, but the one I ended up winning, it went so smoothly that I thought that I played the other ones incorrectly, or what just happened here. We'll get into the reasons why, but basically the way this works is there are 6 villains, but you're going to start with 2 of them randomly chosen, and they're going to be in play. They all have activation orders that basically dictate which villain activates before the other. Both are going to activate against you, so you're essentially taking on 2 villains right from the start, but more can come into play, and eventually all 6 can be in play, and you can have 6 villains activating against you. Now, they do have very, very low health, and it does not scale with player count, which means that Vulture has 7 health. If you play with 4 players, he still has 7 health. Now, there's other ways that obviously the game scales, but this is one of those scenarios that I think does just naturally get easier if you play with like 2 compared to solo, just because it's easier to take out these villains. And as we'll see, I'll look at Vulture right here. The when defeated on Vulture specifically says, when defeated, remove 4 threat from the side scheme, 7 threat instead if no other villain is in play, set this villain aside. Now, why that's important is that you're not trying to defeat the villains to win the scenario. Every time you defeat them, they're going to come back eventually. You are just trying to get the main scheme of this completely cleared twice. There's one side to clear and then another side to clear of threat, and then you've escaped the scenario. So you want threat to be removed, and every time you defeat a villain, it's being removed. So if you're able to kill these really, really quick, you're going to remove a lot of threat with that, and you're going to find that the scenario is a lot easier. So I'm not going to go through all 6 of these villains. I'll highlight a couple of them. Generally, they're all kind of similar in the fact that they have that when defeated effect, and they all have a force response, and each force response is just a little bit different. So for instance, Vulture's says, after Vulture attacks and damages you, choose and discard 1 card from your hand, then move the active counter to the next villain in activation order. So basically, the force response happens, then the active counter goes to the next villain. That's what happens with all of them. They all just do something different. Vulture's having you discard a card from your hand. Kraven, for instance, says after Kraven attacks and damages you, choose and discard 1 support or upgrade you control. Hobgoblin says after he attacks and damages you, take it 2 indirect damage. So they all sort of have this thing that after they attack and damage you, something happens, then the counter moves to the next villain, and that's going to happen again. And again, they all have small amounts of health. I think the highest one we see is 10 health on Scorpion. The lowest we see is 7 on Vulture. So there are ones you might hope you get and play more than the others. You probably will hope for Vulture more than you'll hope for Scorpion necessarily, but again, it depends on the scenario. Scorpion also has 0 schemes, so maybe in some situations that's just a better place for you. So generally, your ease or difficulty of this scenario is going to come down to how many of the Sinister Six end up in play and how quickly you're able to reduce those numbers. So I will say that the first game I played, it went so smoothly for almost the entire thing. I thought I was going to win, and I was like, what am I doing wrong here? And I had the main scheme on the second side. I had it down really low on how much threat was on it. I thought, this is not hard at all. And then suddenly I had 4 villains in play, and those 4 villains being in play completely threw me off and made it so that I wasn't able to get the game back under control. A 5th ended up coming into play, and then it was gone. So really, you have to stop that from snowballing. You might want to say, hey, well, all I have to do is just remove threat from the side scheme. I'm going to ignore the villain, just do everything I can to remove threat. And honestly, you might be able to rush this down in some situations, or at least rush it down part of the way and have that be successful. But generally, it's going to be more effective to just quickly deal with these small health villains to remove threat that way, and also manage how many villains are active and against you. I love that aspect of it, where you're constantly feeling like you're being overwhelmed and trying to control everything. A lot of how well or how bad that goes is going to be which cards come up from the Sinister Six deck, which we'll get into some of them here. The game I won, I got lucky with which cards came up. The games I lost, not so lucky. So the main scheme here that we talked about is Sinister Synchronization, Ambush, Special, choose a set-aside villain at random and put that villain into play and place the active counter on it. In Expert mode, you'll place 2 threat on the Light at the End scheme as well. So the Special being activated is how you're adding more villains into play. So there's other cards that will activate that, and that's how more villains will keep coming into play and making your life a little bit more difficult. There's also a Force Interrupt that when a villain would activate, no villains are in play. If you've eliminated all the villains, you don't just get off the hook. Ambush activates automatically. So there's no way to sort of circumvent that. So Light at the End, this is the one that you need to defeat to be able to win. So it's a permanent card. It starts with 5 threat on it, but it also has Hinder, 10 threat per player. So the more players you're playing with, the more you have to remove. That's sort of how it balances for more players. The players cannot win unless they escape. It starts on the Light at the End chase side. When you remove the last threat from here, I am reading the wrong side. That's the final side. The first side is the trap side, which is Light at the End still, but it starts 10 threat and then an additional 10 per player, but it's essentially the same. So when you remove all the threat from here, you're going to resolve ambush. So the villain's going to enter play. You're going to flip this to the other side, and when you do that again, you're going to win the game. So sorry, I did that a little backwards. But generally what you're trying to do in the scenario to win is escape, and to escape you just have to remove threat from the scheme. So it's a cool integration. We've seen that done before, but the aspect of having to defeat villains to remove threat, and if you ignore them, they build up and all 6 will be in play and overwhelm you, is just really, really cool. It fits the Sinister Six dynamic. So then we will get into some of the other cards. This is when we see the difficulty really shine with this scenario. So for instance, we have Brute Force Barricade. So this is a side scheme that has a 9 threat on it. It has a victory 1, so it'll go to your victory display. It says threat cannot be removed from other side schemes. So when this is in play, suddenly right at the end, you can't remove any threat from it, which means that you have to deal with this to be able to continue your escape. So thematically, you've been barricaded by Kraven and Scorpion, which is really cool, the way they tied that in. And to be able to continue to escape, you have to deal with this. So these are the type of things that are going to slow you down. And if you try to rush something to the finish and you think you're close, suddenly this barricade could come up and just completely stop you from finishing the game, even if you were in a position to have done so. So one of those things you have to prepare for the potential of it coming up, and really wanted to highlight that those cards exist to sort of not let you off the hook. Then we have Partnership of Pain. So when revealed in Alter Ego, the villain with the lowest activation order schemes with X scheme, where X is equal to the total scheme of all villains in play. If you're in hero form, it's the same thing, but it attacks you with the attack value of all villains in play. This is so devastating in some cases. It was the first game I played when I think there was 4 villains out. It wasn't even the 5th one out, but just having all those numbers add up and into one scheme or one attack, and you're not expecting this treachery to come out or that to happen, and you're already been overwhelmed by having all these villains activate against you. Now you have this one super attack coming at you, or this one big scheme could completely end the game. So really devastating card, and one of those cards that really kind of highlights why this scenario is so difficult. It's not just that you're dealing with 4 villains that have low health that are all sort of picking away at you. It's the fact that they all sort of start working in conjunction. You're blocked from escaping. You have these huge attacks and schemes coming out, and you just can't manage everything. So really, really difficult cards. Next one is High Fashion. This is a treachery. This is just the one I'm highlighting, but I think there's 2 others that are essentially just like this, but they focus on different villains. So this says, when revealed, put the set aside Electro and Kraven into play. If Electro's already in play, discard the highest cost card you control. If Kraven is already in play, discard the lowest cost card you control. It's like a tongue twister. These cards suck because this is, you might have been managing the board completely fine. You might have been managing how many times the special gets triggered. You're dealing with the villains quickly, and suddenly you draw this, and 2 additional villains immediately come into play. And if you feel like you're lucky and you think, oh, one of them was already in play, so I only have to bring in 1, you still have to end up discarding cards you control on top of that. So, and there's 2 others like this that end up encompassing all 6 of the villains. So these really suck. These are the ones where I think when you get unlucky and 2 of them come up and 4 villains come into play in a turn, that's just sort of the game where it's gone. It's no fault of your own. It's just really bad luck. Those will happen with this scenario. But either way, you have to kind of be prepared for this and say at any point 2 villains could just jump into play. Am I set up to be able to deal with that? Then we have Surprise. This is a treachery. When revealed, resolve the ambush ability on the main scheme. If no villain was put into play this way, place 3 threat on light at the end. So this is going to make your escape harder because you're adding more threat to it, or you're just triggering. It's another way to trigger the ambush and add more villains in play, which obviously always sucks. And then lastly, we have an attachment called Taunting Presence that I want to talk about. Attached to the villain with the most remaining hit points. If you can't resolve the ambush ability on the main scheme, then attach this card to the active villain. Threat cannot be removed from light at the end. So while this is attached to that villain, you cannot escape, and there's no way to get this to go away unless you defeat that villain. So suddenly, it's something you're already prioritizing beating these villains, but suddenly one of them gets this, and now you have to be able to kill that villain ASAP to even have a chance of escaping the scenario. So there's tons of these cards that come up that just constantly hinder and prevent you from escaping when you might think like, oh, you know what? There's only 15 threat left. If I can find a way to remove 15 threat, I win. Well, yeah, but with all these cards coming up, it's going to be really, really difficult to do that. So awesome scenario all around. I love the Sinister Six. It may be my favorite scenario in the box. I think it probably is my favorite scenario in the box. I just find it the right amount of difficulty. It's not too punishing, but it has the potential to be. It really relies on how well you're maintaining the board and keeping it all together, and just the thematics of having to pick off these villains that constantly come back. You're just constantly being bombarded. Can you escape? I love it. Great scenario all around. All right, finally, spoiler alert here, because I'm going to spoil what the final scenario is. We have Venom Goblin. Honestly, I think they did a really good job with how they closed out the scenario or this expansion box, because we had already got Green Goblin, which is the Spider-Man villain, as its own scenario pack. And so it would have been hard to just say, here's Goblin again, but we did his mechanics differently, right? And so if we hadn't got that pack, everyone would have expected he would have been a big presence in this box all around, or part of the Sinister Six, or his own scenario, whatever. Finding a way to bring him back and make it different by combining, essentially the two most iconic Spider-Man characters besides Spider-Man himself, Venom and Green Goblin, into one, and having that be the final scenario of a Spider-Man box is genius. It's a great idea. I'm not even familiar with this in the comics to know if this is something that's been done. The comics probably has. I'm pretty certain it must have been with all the artwork we've seen here, but it's just very, very cool that they did that in the way they incorporated it. So I appreciated that. Venom Goblin was super challenging. He is not Ronin level difficulty. I don't even think he was. I think if we're just ranking the boxes from end difficulty of the villains, I think the Mad Titan Shadow and Galaxy Most Wanted had more difficult final villains than this, but that's just my experience with Venom Goblin. This is on normal mode, not expert, keep that in mind, but still a really challenging scenario. I think it took me 3 tries. Venom Goblin says, 2 scheme, 2 attack, has steady, infest the city. Force response after Venom Goblin activates against you, move the glider counter to the main scheme with the least threat. Choose to either place 2 threat on that scheme or resolve its special ability. So what does that all mean? Well, essentially what's happening here is you have 3 different side schemes, or main schemes, I guess, not side schemes. So you have Lower Manhattan, you have Midtown Manhattan, and you have Upper Manhattan. And what you're doing here is you're trying to prevent these from being taken and turned into symbiote environments. If 2 of them are, you immediately lose the scenario. So it's not just you being killed, it's you having to maintain these environments as well. Each of them is going to be a main scheme that's on the table, and there's this glider counter, and whichever one the glider counter is on, that's the active main scheme that'll take any threat that is placed on that says place this on the main scheme. It'll go to the one with the glider counter. If you're a moving threat, you'll remove the ones from the glider counter, and that's sort of jumping around, and they all have special abilities. So for instance, Lower Manhattan says special, place 1 threat on each scheme. If a symbiote environment is in play, place 1 additional threat on this scheme. So if one of them is already flipped to the other side and says it's on the environment side, then suddenly it ramps up in difficulty. It gets easier for you to end up having another one flip and you lose the game. So you're trying to maintain all these different side schemes in the same way that you were maintaining all the villains in the Sinister Six. So they sort of kind of brought that over from the Sinister Six, but flipped it from villains to side schemes and had there be this one main villain that's trying to take over a bunch of environments, and you're trying to protect that. So really, really cool. I really like it. It wasn't quite as fun as the Sinister Six for me, but it was my second favorite scenario in the box. I shouldn't say that. I think Mysterio might be my second favorite just because of the uniqueness of it. But basically what I'm saying is Sinister Six, Mysterio, and Venom Goblin, those last 3 are really, really solid scenarios. I had a ton of fun with them, and Venom Goblin really kind of lives up to the hype as this final one. So really cool mechanics, jumping on the side schemes. They are pretty hard to maintain. You have to really be on your toes and knowing where the glider counter is going, which one has the lowest and the highest amount of threat, and is it stable to leave it at that before the glider counter moves? You do really have to do something before the glider counter moves. Just really, really interesting all around maintaining them. So getting to some of the cards, we have Symbiotic Monstrosity, 2 scheme, 2 attack, 6 health with a little star on it, retaliate 1, steady, and toughness. This is a monster, it's a monstrosity of a minion. And it says while a symbiote environment is in play, it also gets +3 hit points, which means it could have 9 hit points. This thing is awful. In both the games I lost, this came out onto the board. I think only in one of the cases there was a symbiote environment in play, which means that it had 9 health. But it's so hard to deal with because the retaliate is pinging back at you. It has toughness that you got, so you have to do that first attack to remove the tough status card as well. It has 6 health, potentially 9 as well. Just a really, really nasty minion. The ones you kind of expect to see in the final scenario of a box, but just really, really bad. Symbiotic Thrall is a smaller symbiotic minion. This is a 1 scheme, 2 attack, 4 health minion that has guard. While a symbiote environment is in play, it also gains patrol, which means you now can't deal with those main schemes. So a very, very, underwhelming minion in some ways when it's on the board until it has patrol and guard, and suddenly you're just forced to deal with this and use your resource to take this out while you might be wanting to do other things, especially if some of those main schemes are getting out of control and you really want to deal with them. So really, really, difficult card in disguise is almost how I describe it. Then we have We Are One. So attached to Venom Goblin, it's an attachment, +3 scheme and +3 attack, completely boosts Venom Goblin stats, and that's all it does, but the only way to remove it is to spend one of each resource from your hand and then discard, or not, it doesn't have to be from your hand, it could be from play, discard the card. So it's a really simple card, there's not much to say about it, just that when that hits Venom Goblin, suddenly he's attacking for, 5 or 6 damage on a single swing without his boost icons, and I have this other thing you're contending with on top of managing all the main schemes. It can start to feel very overwhelming. That's when the scenario really hits its damage peak, or difficulty peak, I should say. So those are all the villains. So like I said, before I jump into the encounter cards here and the other things I want to talk about, I will just say that my favorite scenario was the Sinister Six. I'm a sucker for Spider-Man in general, and the Sinister Six is always something I'd like to see realized. So the way they did it in the card game version was really, really solid. It was difficult, it was fun, it was thematic. That was my favorite one. Mysterio and Venom Goblin are really, really, really close. I almost don't want to say which one is second for me. It might be Venom Goblin, might be Mysterio, depending on the day. They're both really solid scenarios. I love them a lot. After that, Venom and Sandman are close as well. They are a step below the other ones. I would say that I probably enjoyed Sandman a little bit more, and I feel bad putting Venom at the lowest one, but I just found that to be... Sandman was the least interesting of the mechanics in terms of what that villain brings to the table, but I just found it to be a fun one to engage with and a fun first scenario to introduce the expansion. Venom, I guess I had such high hopes that it just felt like a dip a little bit to me, and that's not to say it's bad. I don't want to make it seem like that's a dud scenario in this box. That's just my personal opinion, and I still had a lot of fun with Venom. It's just one of them has to rank. If I'm ranking these 5, one of them has to be last. In this case, it would be Venom, but Venom Goblin obviously is a really big step up from there. So that's why I'd rank the villains. Overall, very solid villains in this box. This is a really strong design across all of the villains and just the box in general. I'm really, really happy with everything in it. So we're going to jump into some of the encounter cards. I'm not going to go over every encounter card, obviously. I'm also not going to go over every single set, but there's certain ones I want to just quickly highlight as some of the standouts for me and ones I really, really enjoyed. So there is the one called Goblin Gear, and this one is Concussive Bombs. I thought these are really, really cool. So this is an attachment. You attach it to the villain. It has 2 uses, which are bomb counters. After the villain attacks you, you remove a bomb counter, then you exhaust and upgrade into support you control. So we see that with another one is called Smoke Bombs. They all have these 2 uses on them, and essentially after the villain attacks you, you're removing one of those bomb counters and bad stuff's happening to you. It's nothing overly difficult or powerful, but I just thought it was a cool thematic thing with having these bomb charges on them, and twice you're gonna have to deal with these nasty effects, and you have to withstand them before this card goes away. I had fun with them when they came out. I just wanted to highlight them. Then we have Guerrilla Tactics, and this one is Hidden in Shadow. So each enemy gains 1 hazard icon, which obviously adds another encounter card. And the reason this is so difficult is because this, with the Sinister Six, is absolutely devastating. It's not hard to deal with because it only has 4 threats. So if you focus on it and you get it at the right time when it comes out, sure, you can deal with it. But if you happen to get this where, you just have a hand that you can't deal with a lot of threat, or it's really difficult for you to find a way to deal with it, having that 1 hazard icon across 4 villains potentially, or each enemy with everything that's in play having a hazard icon is just awful. This basically becomes deal with this immediately. It might as well have guard and patrol and everything on it, because you are going to put all your focus on dealing with this. Otherwise you're going to completely spiral out of control. Another one on Guerrilla Tactics is the same thing. I just want to quickly touch on it. Each enemy gains an acceleration icon. So in the same way, this one's going to ramp up your acceleration. The other one ramps up your, the hazard icon. You're ramping up your encounter cards. Both suck. You need to deal with them if you're playing with the Sinister Six immediately. Then we go into Whispers of Paranoia. This is my favorite encounter set in the entire box because of the way that they incorporated the Nemesis set of cards. I've mentioned it before in the videos. I want there to be more ways to have your Nemesis minion and side scheme of those cards come out besides Shadows of the Past without having to have the entire full set come out. I think that would make them more interesting and you see them more often. Sometimes you don't see some of these cards for some heroes. They found an interesting way to do it where basically it's Mysterio's illusion. So it's not your actual nemesis. It's not your actual things you're dealing with. It's illusions of them, and that's why only certain ones are being brought into play. I thought that was a genius design choice, but let's get into it. So analysis paralysis says when revealed, it only has one threat on it, but it says when revealed, search the encounter deck discard pile and set aside area for your nemesis side scheme, then reveal it. Place X additional threat here, where X is equal to the amount of threat on that side scheme. So it's going to come into play with more threat, and you get your side scheme that you normally wouldn't see unless Shadows of the Past hit, which I love. I'm a huge fan of that. I hope they print more ways for those to come out, and I love the thematic tie and how they did it here. So another one we have here is Manipulated Mind. Treat attached ally, so you attach this to an ally, as a minion with a blank text box except for traits. Attached minion scheme is equal to its printed thwart, and it does not take consequential damage anymore. When revealed, attaches to the ally you control at the lowest cost. If you cannot, this card gains Surge. So just a really cool card in the sense that it takes over your ally. It turns it against you, turns it into a minion, and now you have to deal with it. So you might have played this really powerful ally, and suddenly it's turned against you, and now you have to deal with it. I just thought that was really neat and really, really difficult. Here's the other one I was talking about. This is Old Grudge. So attached minion gets +1 hit point. When revealed, search the encounter deck discard pile and set aside for your nemesis minion, then reveal that minion and attach Old Grudge to it. So you're basically bringing your nemesis minion in with +1 hit point. The +1 hit point is negligible, but again, the big thing here is that without having to draw Shadows of the Past, you're bringing your nemesis into play, which I love. I happened to me a couple times with Mysterio, where Ghost Spider brought in the Lizard, and otherwise I hadn't actually played against the Lizard in any game so far. Shadows of the Past just had not come up for Gwen. So it's just really cool to be able to have Lizard come into play unexpected like that. Again, I said it a lot, but I just love that they found a way to sort of print that additional thing. Then we have Fool's Paradise. So this is a side scheme from Personal Nightmare. It has Victory 1. Each identity gets +2 hand size, but it has every single negative icon on it. The acceleration token, you can't remove threat from the main scheme, and you're adding an extra encounter card. So nasty card, but how long you choose to let it stay in play means you get a bigger hand size. So the reason I brought this one up is that for me, I actually, when it came into play, let it purposely stay in one turn so I could get my +2 hand size to both Miles and Gwen. They both had 8 cards in their hand, and then I eliminated at that point, and I had this huge, powerful turn, but it obviously is a bit offset by all the negative stuff happening to you. So it's really just a cool card because you can choose to sort of leave it in play for as long as you think you can survive it to have all these additional cards in your hand, and that's just a neat card. It's really... it's a risk-reward thing. How much risk are you willing to take to have these additional cards before you have no choice but to deal with it? Next up, we have for Personal Nightmare, Evil Doppelganger. I thought this was a really neat card as well. 5 health, 1 scheme, 1 attack. Evil Doppelganger gets +X scheme and +X attack, where X is equal to the number of identity-specific cards in the engaged player's hand. That in and of itself is really difficult because generally you're always going to have at least one, which means you can expect this to be a 2 scheme, 2 attack. But sometimes you're going to have a bunch, and suddenly Evil Doppelganger is going to be this gigantic minion that you need to deal with. But on top of that, the boost effect here is really interesting. The boost effect is draw 3 cards and discard 3 random cards from your hand. I thought that was a really neat trade-off. You're discarding 3 random cards, which would be such a horrible effect. They couldn't just throw that into a random boost. So they're giving you 3 cards first, but then with 3 random cards, you're likely going to discard something you don't want. So you end up in the situation where you have a bit of a new hand than what you were expecting for the coming turn. So I just thought it was neat. It came up a few times. Osborne Tech, we're getting into some of the cards now that are specifically for the campaign. So Osborne Tech is one that you'll see come up in the actual campaign. It'll say you have to shuffle in, or choose a random Osborne Tech card, and that's going to get added to the encounter deck for each scenario. It's a cool little thing. It's powering the villains with this interesting tech. The one that I was dealing with was called Tracking Display. This says Surge. It says attached to the villain. Each character cannot defend against attached villain's attacks. Not being able to defend against the villain really sucks in some scenarios. So that really is horrible, especially specifically for Ghost Spider, because there's so much you can do with defending with Ghost Spider and triggering her hero ability, readying her again. Not being able to defend at all really slows you down. The only way to get rid of this is to exhaust a character you control and discard 1 random card from your hand to discard that card, which is doable, but again, slows you down a little bit. So I just thought that was kind of neat. Really quickly, I just want to talk about the encounter set that is the Sinister Assault. So they have taken all 6 of the Sinister Six minions, given them all 6 health, which I thought is hilarious, great little thematic tie there, and they've turned them into an encounter set. This is going to be such a fun encounter set to have in the game, because I would love to go back and play a whole bunch of scenarios and include Sinister Assault and just have random Sinister Six villains coming out in the game. It's for sure going to make it more difficult. A lot of these are very difficult minions. They all have villainous. They have a bunch of other effects on them as well. They all have 3 boost icons on them. So there's a lot of really nasty stuff on here. But just having that in the game and having that option to power up scenarios and say, I'm going to take on Rhino again, but now I'm going to give them the Sinister Six, so it's not just such an easy cakewalk. I just thought it was great, so I just wanted to touch on that. The last thing we're going to touch on is a really, really cool addition to this box that I was not aware of until I got the box myself. It's so exciting. I'm going to take a sip of coffee first. And that is the fact that we received cards that outside of Miles and Gwen, their decks, that are basic cards that you can include anywhere in the game outside of this campaign. They're cards you can deck build with now. One of them has like the flavor of being a campaign specific card, but yet is allowed to be included in your deck, which is super cool. And that one is a really exciting card because it is a basic ally and it is Venom Eddie Brock himself. So this can be included in any deck building you want to do for any hero. It is a 4-cost ally, 6 health, 2 thwart, 3 attack, only 1 consequential damage. So powerful. On top of that, after you reveal an encounter card, deal 1 damage to Venom to deal damage to an enemy equal to the number of icons, any kind of boost icons, in that card's boost area. So obviously this is a really, really ridiculously powerful card, but it does have the downside in that you do have to get dealt an extra encounter card every single time, as long as this stays out every single turn. So it's interesting that we're seeing that on these, and the next card kind of gets into that too. They're giving us these really souped up cards in this expansion box that you might not ever expect to be able to deck build with, but they have this drawback that says, can you deal with this drawback? Is it worth it to put this in your deck? I thought that was such a neat inclusion. I would love to see them include that in every expansion box going forward. Have it be that, some of the cards that you encounter in the campaign that might seem overpowered, really powerful, have this drawback and can be deck built outside in other heroes as well. I love that. And of course, Venom as a basic ally is just super, super exciting. The last one that a lot of people have been talking about, this is Symbiote Suit, 4-cost upgrade, max 1 per deck. Your identity gets +1 to each of its basic powers, attack, thwart, and defense, all get +1, and you get +1 to hand size, and you get +10 hit points. This is nuts. This is an absolutely ridiculous upgrade. Yet it costs 4. It is very expensive, and it does have the hazard icon, which means you're also getting an extra encounter card dealt towards you. But this is going to be such a fun card to playtest with. It might not be worth it in a lot of situations, but that is a lot of upside. 10 hit points can make all the difference in solo play with a lot of heroes that, as of right now, just have too low hit points to be viable. I shouldn't say to be viable in solo, but make the solo experience very difficult. Suddenly, you can turn Miles into a 19 health hero, which is a big deal. +1 to all your basic abilities as well, and +1 to your hand size. Like, that is so much potential power. And yes, you're dealing with 1 extra encounter card, but for certain scenarios, that might not be that much of a detriment. So this is a really interesting card, probably the most exciting card, honestly, in the box that they included. We get 4 copies of them, so you have extra copies to deck build with as well, so you can play with 4 players, and each one has one in their deck. Thematically, it's really, really cool. I honestly am so pumped they included that card, and I just think it's such a great addition. Okay, so overall thoughts here. Let's talk about the heroes first. I'll just get right to it. My favorite of the 2 heroes is Ghost Spider. I actually enjoy Ghost Spider a lot more than I enjoy Miles. I don't think Miles is a bad hero. I don't have a bad time playing with him. The more I played with him in the campaign, the more I came to appreciate the comboing you do with his base abilities and Venom Blast and Spider Camouflage and triggering those. I did have a lot of fun with him, but my personal playstyle, Ghost Spider, is just resonating way more. I love that she is so effective as a protection hero. Protection is my favorite aspect, so I'm biased there as well. Being able to defend and then trigger her abilities off of that defense as well means that you're doing damage on the villain's turn and still being ready and defending against an attack. Super powerful. So many of the same reasons I love Quicksilver is because of what he can do on the villain's phase. Ghost Spider to me is just the big winner here. That's just my opinion. I would love to hear what you guys think and why you gravitate to one one or the other. I've seen a lot of people talking about both heroes in the comments of the reviews, and both seem to be getting lots of love. I just personally love Ghost Spider. But also, I just want to mention that these are, out of all the campaign boxes, this is my favorite duo of heroes in terms of power level, in terms of thematics, in terms of fun. If we compare to Hawkeye and Spider-Woman and Groot and Rocket Raccoon and Adam Warlock and Spectrum, this is my favorite duo by far. Like it's not even close, and I don't want to make it seem like the other ones are bad, because I really did like Mad Titan Shadow's duo. Galaxy Most Wanted, which was a little bit of a letdown after we saw the other Guardians and how unique and powerful they were, but they weren't bad by any means. And Hawkeye and Spider-Woman, I love Spider-Woman. Hawkeye, take them or leave them, I guess. But this one is just both. Not only do I love both heroes, I'm much more drawn to Spider-Man than almost any other heroes when it comes to comics in general. I wasn't huge into comics growing up, but Spider-Man is just one of those characters that I think resonates with a lot of people. So having the Miles Morales version and the Ghost Spider version, which is two characters I didn't grow up with, but now to see sort of embodied with that Spider-Man theme and new characters was super exciting. And to have all the Web Wars come in, all the allies come in with them, just a really, really solid pack all around. Really exciting pack. The villains are really, really good. Again, my favorite one is Sinister Six. I think that's the standout for me, but there wasn't really a bad villain in this scenario. They were all really, really fun. The difficulty scaled really well as you went up. Venom Goblin was difficult, but wasn't too difficult in the way that Ronin was. It wasn't quite as... The one thing this box doesn't have going for it is the story is super weak. I'll be completely honest. The story is not good. And I don't mean that. And the reason I'm being so blunt about it is that I think we've had enough of these boxes by now that it would be nice to see some sort of other way to engage with the story. You don't have to go down the full road of, Arkham Horror, the card game, where it's fully entrenched in the story and the thematics and branching paths and everything. But I think we do need to get some sort of injection of something new in the story, because the single comic pages just aren't that exciting. And when we see the storytelling being done by the MCU and in comics in general, I think it just deserves a little bit more. And I know that everyone maybe feels that way, but for me, I just find that many times I'm just forgetting to even read the comic page, because it's just, it's not something I'm super engaged with. So the reason I bring this up is that, as strong as this box is, I think that Mad Titan Shadow to me is still the most interesting thematically from a story perspective, because they found a way to integrate this big story moment in the snap into the gameplay itself, which kind of brought the story to the forefront in an interesting way. And it had the Hela scenario that was this really thematic story-driven experience as well. So that's what this box is lacking. If it's lacking anything, it's lacking some better story connection, thematic tie. But besides that, I think that this might be the best expansion box we've had released for Marvel Champions. If it's not this one in my eyes, so far, if I was forced to rank them, I'd probably go Sinister Motives, Mad Titan Shadow, and Mad Titan Shadow would be very close to the Rise of the Red Skull, and then it would be Galaxy's Most Wanted. I know some people put like Rise of the Red Skull higher. That's just my preference, again, mostly because of the Hela and Thanos scenarios. But this is a really, really strong box. This arguably could make a case for being sort of the one you start with if you're just getting into Marvel Champions. Maybe you still start with the Red Skull one, but I don't think this is too much of a leap up, and it's so interesting and fun that I think for Spider-Man fans, why not just start here? So really, really good addition all around. I just really wanted to kind of highlight that and say that everything about this box besides the story is just great. Villains are great, heroes are great. They include a Venom basic ally and a symbiote suit that you can use outside of the campaign. The modular sets give you a Sinister Six modular set and a bunch of other really cool ones, like the Mysterio one that brings your Nemesis into play. There's just so much good stuff here. If you're considering, getting into Marvel Champions, you're like, where do I start? At least look into starting with Sinister Motives if you're not wanting to do it in order, because I think this is probably one that I think a lot of people are just going to absolutely adore as we go on and as we get further away from it. There's always the shine in your eyes, in the same way that when Galaxy Most Wanted came out, it took a while before I think some people realized, okay, maybe on some ways it was a bit of a weaker expansion. This one I think is going to sort of grow on people even more over time. I could be wrong, but that's just the way I feel about it now. So those are my thoughts on Sinister Motives. A very strong expansion box. We've talked about two great heroes, all these great villains. Let me know what you think in the comments about Sinister Motives. What are your favorite parts of the box? What are your least favorite parts of the box? Are there things I didn't mention here or cards I didn't highlight that you want to hear talked about? Thank you so much for watching and enjoying the Marvel content. Marvel Champions content over the last week. We are going to be getting 2 new hero packs, I believe, in May, so there might be a bit of a gap before we see more Marvel Champions content, but in about a month's time, you're going to be getting 2 new hero reviews for a couple exciting heroes coming out as well, and that's probably how we'll continue until the next expansion box. So thank you so much for watching. If you're not in our Discord and you want to join, check the description below. If you want to find other ways to support us, it's all in the description. Otherwise, we will see you next time.